Hello everyone, I'm Troy Dodds and welcome to the On The Record podcast presented by The Western Weekender. On this podcast I'm joined by special guests who all have such great stories to tell about Penrith and the role they've played in our city. They are Penrith stories told by Penrith's people. Today my special guest is Richard Fox, an Olympian in 1992. Richard won a swag of medals during his canoe slalom career representing Great Britain. His move to Australia and later to Western Sydney proved pivotal for many reasons. It's a great story and a great Penrith family. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here, Troy.
First question we always ask, where and when were you born? Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Somerset in the southwest of England and moved pretty quickly to Hertfordshire in the home counties, just north of London. Went to school there and left home at 18 to take on my paddling career and moved to the Midlands. Stafford and Stone Canoe Club is where I ended up, and then Birmingham University and my time in the UK sort of finished up in Nottingham, and then I moved away at the age of 26.
And canoeing was in the family. I'm right in saying that's how you got introduced to it?
Absolutely. Well, it was in the family in the sense that my father came up with the idea of getting us into canoeing as a sport, as a family, and we built our first canoes out of plywood from kits. Plywood kit canoe, and we went on family holidays and camping and so on. And my brother and sisters, well, one of my sisters will say, you ruined our childhood with this canoeing obsession, because once I got into competition, I was sort of bitten by the bug and never looked back, and so we would go around the country to various competitions too.
As much as you were competitive and doing all of that, I have read that you were still pretty focused on studies as well. Education was pretty important to you, even though the two can probably work against each other at times.
Well, to a degree, yes, but not as much as actually now Jess and Naomi were when they went through school and university. Or my brother, who I thought I was much smarter than, he did a PhD. I dropped subjects, did phys ed as a subject at Birmingham University. But I went through high school, went to university, but I took a long time to finish my degree in between heading off to World Championships.
Mid-1970s, you made the British junior canoe slalom team that year. Were you ever reluctant to get into the sport competitively, knowing that this was a pretty big task? Or was it something that once you were in, you were in?
Well, I guess the story of the early days was that I was playing football, soccer, for Harpenden Rovers Football Club. Look it up. They were, Mid-Hearts League, Division 3 sort of thing. But I really enjoyed that on the weekends, and I was encouraged to go and start the canoe slalom competitions. And I said, well, I'm playing football. I can't do it. And eventually they got me there, and I did all right. So that was it. Once you get that sort of bug of doing well at something and you enjoy it, and it was challenging, learning quickly, I never looked back, as they say.
Didn't necessarily come easy to you though. You had some trouble on the water in the early years.
Well, there's always some learning in a whitewater environment like that. Eskimo rolling on sort of cold winter trips to Wales we used to do. Smashing into rocks here and there. I mean, I wouldn't say it's sort of the early years, but probably one of those memories of where things went wrong. Well, one of them was on a TV show it was called Paddles Up, where I was sort of failing on my Eskimo roll and struggling, and they loved doing the replay showing how a world champion couldn't even get back up right. Another time I hit a rock head on at full speed. So imagine, coming down whitewater. I was in a downriver racing kayak, and it was a full-on collision, stopped dead, and then sort of surfed back up across the river, ended up in hospital and on crutches for the next race. And now in my old age, I feel that in my ankle. But that's probably the worst thing that's happened to me in all these years. So it's not too bad compared to, say, playing footy.
The late 70s through to the 80s, you have some awesome success in the K1, many World Championship gold medals. Your career really took off during that period.
Yes, and I was lucky that I came into the sport at a really good time in that there was a world champion. My first World Championships, I was 17 years old. And you've done your research well. Yeah, the 70s was when I sort of got going on the junior team. And then I was selected. I was actually still 16 when I travelled. I was 17. And, I was a bit young and naive and in the big league. But one of the British team that year, he'd given up work and he was training full time. And he won the gold medal at my first World Championships. And I thought, that's pretty cool. I'm not that far behind him. And 2 years later, I won a bronze medal. The Worlds were every 2 years then. And 2 years after that, 81, I was 21, was when I won my first World Championship. So, but that sort of defining moment was really inspirational to sort of see that somebody I was training with was at that level. And I thought, okay. And he worked incredibly hard, trained hard. He was really tough. And that sort of set the culture really for me, set the standard.
I guess this could be asked of any individual sport, whether it's golf, tennis, but is it a lonely sport in terms of what's the camaraderie like team-wise, but also you don't sort of have that team environment as far as pushing each other from an actual game perspective. It's kind of it's just you out there on the water and you out there training. Discipline must have to be pretty full on to succeed.
Yeah, and especially in those early days, in the sort of late 70s and through the 80s, there wasn't a lot of support. There weren't sort of high-performance structures and programs and full-time coaches and sports science and video. So it was a lonely time often on the river, and I did a lot of training on my own or with some training partners. But in the UK at the time, we had a good club community, so that was good. Tuesday nights. I mean, things are different. It's like all sports. So, club session and then down the pub for pie and chips sort of thing. But today, it's still an individual sport. You race one at a time in the classic slalom event. But it's a much more structured group environment. So they're training on man-made courses. I was on training and competing on natural rivers. So, we would drive into Wales or up to Scotland in the UK and hang our own courses across the river, and it was small groups, but it was a good community, and in fact that community is still quite strong. They organise reunions, a bit like the 91 premiers here. They get together, and you don't forget those times. So I never felt alone, and but I would say that to succeed, I needed to train alone a lot to do the work, and that was sometimes tough in the British winters, rocking up and changing under a bridge and getting on the water and feeling the sort of icy water on your fingers.
And it must be tough because if that's a footy team or something like that, well, there's just an expectation that there's 20 of you turning up at whatever time of the morning. You have to be there. For you, it's letting yourself down if you don't go there. You could say, well, I'm just going to stay in bed this morning, and it's the mornings you don't say that, you do get up, that make the difference in the end at World Championships and things like that.
Yeah, and there are phases, I think, all of us have that in life where you get into that flow of discipline, whatever it is. It could be work, it could be looking after your health. And I think as an elite sports person, you have to do it. You have to find that way of motivating and yourself. And I would say that everybody struggles with that at a certain point, and it might be much more limited for a successful athlete. But I remember times where and it was usually winter. You just can't get going. I look back and understand it, and you sort of think, okay, today's the day I'm going to sort of get going again, and then your car break down in the snow. And you go, okay, what do? Do I walk home or do I walk to the gym? And that was a sort of defining moment too. And I remember I thought, well, if I want to win the World Championships, the gym's going to help me. So I walked to the gym through the snow, did my gym, and then figured out how to get my car, towed home and fitted out. So, but yeah, there are times where you struggle with that, and then there are times where you're on a roll and you want to sort of anchor in on those.
Your success through the 80s actually results in you being awarded an MBE in England in I think it was 1986. Quite an honour.
Well, it was, yeah, absolutely. And I guess in those days, it was generally an Olympic an Olympic medal or even an Olympic gold medal that sort of led to that type of recognition. At that point, I'd won, I think, 3 consecutive world championships. So, yeah, I was very proud, and going to Buckingham Palace and wearing a top hat and, all the fancy suit, coat and tails. I've still got the photos, still got the MBE. I don't flash it around, really, because, represents a different era for me. But, yeah, certainly it's something I look back at with pride.
You mentioned the Olympics there, and you get to the Olympics in 1992 in Barcelona. Tell me about the journey to get there.
So that was the first opportunity for me to compete, because in 72, the Olympics, canoe slalom was in Augsburg in Germany, part of the Munich Olympics, and then it was out of the program for 20 years. And so 92 was my first chance. I was 32 years of age. I would say it was twilight time in terms of my career. My best years, you've said, through the 80s, really. I won 81, 83, 85, and then 89 World Championships. But then once you're in that Olympic program, people lift their game everywhere. I wasn't winning as many races, and even though I was sort of one of the favourites going in, I was probably... where I ended up 4th in the games is probably where I belonged in terms of those years, 1991, 92, leading into the games. So, it was a great disappointment. I was the last boat down the course. I knew what I had to do, pretty much. And, the time just ticked away by a few tenths from the medal. But I'm not overly disappointed with that, because it was, as I say, it was the end of a great career that I felt I'd had. And
I guess 4th is tough in some instances, because of we know how it all works. But do you sometimes feel, could you have done anything differently, or did you walk away from that feeling, well, I did everything I could in both prep and on the day?
Yeah, I did feel that I'd done everything I could. I mean, in hindsight, it's probably something, and it's easy to say in hindsight that, equipment plays a role in your performance, and the sport, when I was racing, the competitions were pretty much 3.5 minutes, and they got shorter just before the games, and the games was, it was like just over 1.5 minutes, so it's a much shorter, more dynamic effort, and that caught a few of us by surprise, and the type of equipment I think could have been different. But when I was there, I do remember I thought, I didn't want to leave anything. I wanted to put everything out there. And on my first run, because in those days it was the best of 2 runs, I was the fastest by quite a few seconds, but I hit a few gates, and so that wasn't going to win. And then on the second run, I was like, okay, I want to do the same thing, but I just dipped back into a bit more of a conservative style. So I feel, in the training and in the way I engaged in the race, I was fully present, I was ready, and on the day, the guys in front, they were the next generation. They were young athletes who were ready to go. So I have nothing but sort of fond memories of that time.
What about the Olympic experience itself in general? Obviously, the sport's allowed you to see the world during this period, both at the World Championships and now the Olympics. But the Olympic Village, that whole feel in 1992, what was an Olympic experience like?
Oh, look, it was amazing, and we lived it fully. Miriam, my wife, was there too. She was competing for France. There was some, funny things. So, for example, our event was in the Pyrenees, so a couple of hours out of Barcelona. So we had what they call a sub-site, and we stayed actually in a college in the middle of this smallish town. So, by today's standards, it was sort of fairly rudimentary. But it was a really good community. So all the teams were in there, and there's cafeteria, and you could walk to the course, and of course. We went there a lot for training camps, training weeks after weeks after weeks. And then the good thing about our sport was that we were in the first 5 days of the Olympics. And once you'd finished competition, in those times, you could go into Barcelona, you go into the main Olympic Village. You've done what you've done, competition's over. And then you discover, that whole world of being an Olympian and going to see other sports, supporting the teams and so on, and enjoying, as a young person, you get out and about and enjoy the city life too. So that was really, really good, really special. And, going to a big stadium and, watch the athletics closing ceremony, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, very, very good memories of all of that. Not so good for Miriam. I think she didn't do as well in Barcelona, but we'll come to her story another time perhaps. But in Atlanta she made amends for it. But I think now it's very different, the Olympic experience, because it's a much more of a sort of, in and out, come in, do your competition and then come out, and you don't get that same thing. You don't put people, it's not Club Med or anything like that. But in those days, I think it was wonderful and colourful, and it's a real eye opener.
You mentioned that this was pretty much the twilight of your career. So your career on the water ends, and you live life for a few years, I guess. But then the thoughts of moving to Australia, or the opportunities of moving to Australia, start to emerge. So tell me about that lead up. Obviously, we're aware at this point the Olympics are coming to Sydney. You mentioned about canoe slalom being out of the Olympics before. It was under threat again. You're involved in all of that. So tell me about this whole period that leads to you coming to Australia.
Yeah, so we're talking, from 92. Well, actually, I should finish up on a high note. So the year after the Olympics, 93, I was, what am I going to do? Am I going to give it away? Do I want to go on to Atlanta? And I thought, well, I'll have a crack at the World Champs. I just make the British team. We had 4 spots that time. I was 4th. I'd moved to France, was living there, and came back, just made the team. And then my training was late, and I finished winning the World Champs. And that was sort of, I thought, that's it, now it's time. And the week after, we were about to embark on the World Cup season. And I remember, and this is the story of sort of how I ended my competition career. We'd had a big celebration in, the week of that World Cup. And I was a bit tired, and I'm lying down by the side of the course. And then a coach from one of the teams came and said, I thought you were going to retire. And I just thought, that's a good idea. So I withdrew from the competition, and that was it, because it just seemed to make sense. I knew I was going to get smashed on the weekend because I'd had a big, social week, having won the Worlds. So then through the 90s, so we started a family. Jess was born in 94, and Miriam made a comeback to go to Atlanta, where she won a medal. So I was sort of in a supporting role. They had a good coaching system in France, but I was there too. And we were living in Marseille. I was working in the sort of distribution business in the canoe industry. And then, yes, when it was announced, in fact, that canoeing wouldn't be, the slalom wouldn't be in Sydney around 96, coming out of the Games, Michael Knight, remember him, Minister for the Olympics. I was working in France. The French, they were very sort of strong in the sport, and they wanted to sort of lead the campaign to reverse that decision. So I said, well, I can help. And I came out to Australia in 96, 97 quite a few times, and got to know people in Penrith, the city council. Some of the councillors are still here. Kevin Kramery was mayor at the time. Ross Fowler, general manager, was...
maybe Alan Travers?
Alan, yes. Yeah, Alan. Yep. Alan Travers and Alan Stoneman was around too. Yep. Steve Hackett, Bruce McDonald. Yeah, so, Alan Travers was GM. That's right. And, we formed, strong relationship. They wanted the velodrome.
Yep.
And so they said, well, we like your story, but we're hanging out for the velodrome. We had to find people in. There's some really interesting local stories in this. So Pacific Power was involved as the designer and builder of the venue, and I met the engineer who delivered that project. But I believe the CEO at the time was Peter Graham, who's now, of course, chair of Panthers. So Pacific Power, I have to say, were really crucial to the deal coming off. And then we had to find the money, so Penrith City Council and the sport. So my job was to sort of convince the federations and convince the city that it was a good investment. And eventually We went to the meeting with the minister and put the deal on the table. They accepted it, and pretty much straight away they said, yes, you're in, and that was it. We started the design process, and the course was built. And during that time, Australia hired a coach, and that turns out that was me. So we came for 2 years, basically to get through to the Sydney Games and see what life would offer us, and then make a choice. And we've been here ever since. And the girls, grew up here. They were both born in France and moved here. Noemi was 1, Jess was 4.
And at this time, obviously, makes sense to base yourself in this area because the stadium's being built here. So, what did you think of the community at that time when you first came to Penrith?
I don't remember too much about the very first sort of the early days, but no, we were welcomed in. We sort of, and Jess, I remember she went to I think 4 different primary schools because we started in Glenmore Park, and then we went to Emu Plains. And then we moved to Leonay. We bought a house there, and then she went to Glenbrook. That was her final sort of stop in primary school. I really enjoyed integrating into the community here. But it was really a young family, busy times, training a team, traveling overseas, and I would say that it wasn't really until I finished working in high performance sport that I started to sort of fully appreciate community and the location and everything that this region has to offer, because 4 months of the year overseas, 3 to 4 trips a year to do competitions, so and a young family in the early days. So we lived in that sort of microcosm of high performance sport, whereas it's a different story today.
The Whitewater Stadium, of course, is a big focal point for the Olympics in Penrith. I reckon that most Penrith residents hadn't watched much canoe slalom or known much about the sport at all until that moment. So it becomes not only great for the Olympics, but it links Penrith with this sport forever, really, and right through until today with the facilities still there and still doing great things. So it really gave Penrith almost a new sport, a new passion that it probably had really no connection with previously.
That's very true, and a lot of those athletes that raced, in Sydney 2000 here in Penrith, they would have come in 99, 2000 training camps, and many of them are now coaches or involved in the sport. Or actually, there's an Italian here, Pierpaolo Ferrazzi. He's the guy who won the gold in Barcelona when I was 4th, and his son's now on the Italian team. He won a bronze at the Sydney Olympics, and I saw him the other week here coaching. So. Very much Penrith's place globally is there forever as an Olympic venue. We had the World Championships here in 2005, and it's still, up until COVID, very popular as a destination for training, and it's, we're coming back into that. But we lost, 21, 22, 23 were sort of tough years, as we know, for visitation. But certainly we're there and remembered.
You mentioned that you'd come originally for 2 years. So when does the line get drawn in the sand that you're staying?
Well, there were probably 2 lines. I mean, one was then after the Sydney Games, and then another 4-year contracts in sport, generally through an Olympic cycle. Probably the turning point was 2004. So the girls were sort of 10 and 8, and their experience had been, living here and following their parents back to Europe, staying with their grandmother, and a bit of school and school in France. And by that time, you can kind of weigh up pretty easily what it feels like going to school in France or going to school in Australia. And it was a no-brainer for the girls. We prefer to go to school in Australia because it's not as strict, and it's I think a better environment for them to sort of flourish as young people, and that was the determining factor, because Miriam had been offered a good job and a contract in the sport in France, but we chose to stay here, and that was it. That was we were citizens in 2004, and so the journey continued. 20 years later, we're still here.
Yeah, and you mentioned, of course, you're raising a family at this point, so let's talk family. Let's talk your wife Miriam first. obviously you met through the sport, but tell us about that. Those early days of meeting Miriam, and also how you're balancing. You're both in the sport, high commitments, both representing different countries. Tell us about that period.
Yeah, it's not always easy, is it? Those sort of long distance relationships, but the common ground was we were doing the same thing. We're both passionate about it. It's always good to hear the other side of the story, and hopefully you'll get to hear that from Miriam. But I was. Yeah, I guess I'd won 3 world championships by then, so that was 86, and this is when you realise, luck comes into a lot of things to do with relationships. So Miriam, in the French system, she'd qualified, trained as a teacher, but was seconded essentially to be able to train full time, and which meant she, was free to travel. She could come and spend time training in the UK. I was quite often invited to go and train or compete internationally, so we sort of teamed up in all of that. So those were really really great times where we're pursuing the same passion. We were able to travel together. We were successful enough that we were able to fund all of that activity, and we were still successful. So that was from sort of 86 through till when I stopped in 93. And Miriam won 2 world titles during that time as well. And they were great memories. We went down the Grand Canyon together on 2 trips. We competed in Canada, North America, and we came to Australia together a couple of times. So I think that's sort of where those early trips, and I'd been here before I'd met Miriam. I think I came out in 82, 83, went to Western Australia and then to Melbourne. Not to Sydney at all. There was nothing to paddle on around here. So we'd had an early connection with Australia together, and we came out a couple of times, and beautiful memories from those trips too. And then we got married in Marseille and lived in France. I had to brush up on my French language and vocabulary and all the rest of it. And that was really, it was a really beautiful time in our life because cultures are very different. Mediterranean, and I'm British, it's a bit like Big Fat Greek Wedding story, really.
2 daughters, of course, both who go into the sport. Was that ever in doubt? Or do you think that they just had this natural inkling that they were going to follow you, given there was so much around it growing up?
I don't know that it was ever in doubt, but there were times where, you wondered if it was going to happen, because there was even Jess will tell her story, but, reluctance at a certain point. That's your sport, not mine, and, don't push me. I'll paddle when I'm ready. But we introduced them early on to, sitting in boats, messing around if you're on the sea in Marseille, or, when we're in Australia. Paddling on the river and just sort of gentle introduction, and it was obviously a natural and easy thing for us to introduce them to. But in both cases, we had to sort of go about it at their pace and not push too hard. And I think Miriam's sort of background, she's trained as a teacher. She'd come through the club system, and she was really good on that sort of early development. In terms of do other sports, learn so swimming and gymnastics, and they might look back at that and go, we hated going to swimming training, or we hated, but those sort of things were formative in athletic development, and an early specialisation sometimes works against you. So there was a little bit of that, and then Jess, a bit like my early days, once she sort of started, she picked it up really quickly. And so I think that was good. Tougher for Noemi, sort of following behind.
It is in any sibling situation, I guess.
But eventually she thrived too, and I think it's the community. When you do a sport and you've got others around you, then that provide sort of peer support, then it's that works well. And Jess definitely had that, and then you're part of a community going forward.
Jess obviously emerges and becomes the best paddler in the world on many occasions, and indeed an Olympic gold medalist. Was there a moment when you went, there's something like ultra special here? This isn't just she's great on the water and she might have some success, but this is something else.
I think for Jess, the word, first time, surprise. I think it was the Youth Olympic Festival, the Australian Youth Olympic Festival. So that was an initiative of the Olympic Committee set up after Sydney 2000, and I can't remember the year, maybe it was 2009, something around there, and she was 15 years of age, something, and she just suddenly, blitzed the course, and we thought, where did that come from? And that was really interesting. And then when she did her first international race, I think it was in Italy, must have been later that same year, a similar thing happened, and you thought, we haven't seen that before. Where did that come from? So that was quite special, and not everybody does sort of make that early impact, and others they do develop over time. The two boys selected to go to Paris, their story when they were announced to the team was, it's taken me 10 years from sort of moving to Penrith and training to reach this goal, and they're Tim Anderson, he turns 30 like Jess this year. So everyone has their own journey, but in her case there were those sort of early signs of, this is a big competition, there's a stage, and she was surprising in how she could kind of suddenly just pull out a performance that we hadn't seen at that level previously, so there were signs there, yes.
The girls obviously compete against each other, of course. How do they go with that? How is that competitive nature, given they're two sisters, the closest sisters, I guess, as well, but then they become competitors?
I think it's a really good point now where, Naomi's caught right up, and she's, not sort of thinking of herself, I'm just the little sister, this is my place. She's challenging, and in the training environment and in competition, in the recent competitions, she's, putting down scores that are as good or better sometimes, and so and there's a collaboration there. They obviously know each other incredibly well and understand that, and so I think there's a strength there now, and I feel that in a way it's taken a bit of a while to get there, but that'll be good for both, and certainly it'll keep Jess on her toes, and Naomi's, she's not sort of looking at Jess as a ceiling. It's something that she's trying to break through. So that's really heartening to see.
A couple of years ago now, we are in Olympic year now, of course, in 2024, but we had the 2020 Olympics pushed to 2021, and there's some pretty iconic footage of you commentating for the Seven Network as Jess wins gold, and it's a very calm and collected Richard Fox, but what were you feeling on the inside?
Oh, well, yeah, that was a tough emotional period because there were highs and lows. Like the role I played with Seven was as a co-commentator with David Colbert, who's experienced in across a number of sports and a very good professional there. And it was actually a late decision. It was clear from relatively early on that I wouldn't be going to Tokyo because of all the complications around COVID and so on. And then the idea of doing the commentary came to the fore sort of relatively late, and it was more a question of what will that be like. And I felt that it was just an opportunity to really sort of almost feel like I was part of the games in the way that I had been previously. I used to be on the bank and watching, and when you're doing commentary, you're fully invested in what's going on. And it starts easily because it's qualifying rounds and it's the Olympics, and there's only a small number of competitors there, so you get into a groove. But once you get to semi-finals, there's tension, and then finals, there's more tension. And the iconic moment, if you like, was when there was disappointment, and then that period of sort of doubt, I suppose, and that was challenging. So to be sort of experiencing, what was obviously a disappointment for Jess, and then having to sort of be objective about it, and then wondering how she was going to transform her performance for, what was really her, signature opportunity. The women's canoe event was the first time. She'd been a pioneer in terms of her performance and leadership really amongst that community. So yeah, that those sort of 48 hours I think were kind of etched in all of our. They are and will always be etched in our memories as intense. We still talk about it, and it comes up, and it's an emotional time. But it was incredible.
I think we could all feel it through the TV screen as well.
We
were watching it all unfold. You obviously have stayed very involved in the sport, also in the Olympic movement. So explain to us what you are currently doing in that space.
So. Leading into that, I was the performance director for Paddle Australia through to the Rio Olympics, and then I did a bit of sort of ad hoc coaching work. I worked with the French team actually for a little bit, 2017, 18, 19. And then since then, so the last few years, I've just been doing sort of projects, and I principally around the 2025 World Championships, which we'll be hosting here, Penrith Whitewater, October 2025. A little bit about the long range sort of projects to do with Brisbane 2032. So those games were awarded in 2021, so a long way out. So some design working groups and being part of the early projects up there. And then during COVID got involved with the Chamber of Commerce, and sort of that was where I discovered another community sort of within a community, and I've really sort of enjoyed that, and I try and sort of marry those two things together. But certainly the paddle work around 2025, we also worked on a transformational project for the whole precinct under the government West Invest initiative, which we weren't successful with, but that aspiration remains. So I guess I'm sort of at the forefront of campaigning for that. So we've heard a lot about the Penrith Beach, which is great, but we've got the Regatta Centre, we've got the Whitewater Centre, that legacy from the Sydney Olympics, and how do we transform that into something that's sustainable for another 25 years plus, but is much more open to community in terms of what it's got to offer for health, leisure, well-being, and not just about being a high-performance sport precinct.
You mentioned the Chamber of Commerce there. So, you're now the president of the Penrith Valley Chamber of Commerce. Been around for a long time. That's allowed you, I guess, to step out of sort of that sporting lane into a much more broader business role. You enjoy that, obviously. You seem to have thrived in it. And the Chambers, I think, had a bit of a roller coaster ride over its existence, but it seems like it's in a pretty good place at the moment.
Yeah, I do enjoy it, and sometimes I think, well, what is it? And I think we talk about business is community and creating a community. So you've got business owners, and a lot of them are small business owners, and you realise that when you go back to that comment about doing things on your own, and a lot of business owners, I think, feel that they're in a lonely world. They've got that responsibility. And all those pressures. And I think one of the things the Chamber does well and can do well going forward is bringing those people together so they can sort of feed off one another, learn from one another, and sort of feel that support that they're not alone. And we have that the sort of second part of that slogan, business is communities, don't do business alone. There are people out there who can help and support. So I sort of see my role partly as helping, engage with that community and bring them together. And we've got a great team and some initiatives that, our chamber members have developed, which are really good. And it's exactly about that. The Chamber Collective is bringing business owners together from different sectors and learning off one another. And then, it's putting Penrith on the map a bit more and sort of saying, okay, what are the big things that need to happen here, in visitor economy or in manufacturing, or I think health is a topic we'll look at later in the year. So I enjoy that, I suppose, opportunity to project some thinking and ideas, but again, bringing people together to talk and collaborate is really what I see my role as. And certainly in tourism and the visitor economy, we're trying to do that, working closely with Blue Mountains and that community. So rather than just being Penrith-centric, we're saying, we're our natural brothers and sisters, if you like. So it's Blue Mountains, it's Hawkesbury, and sort of stretching along the rail line is probably the best way to put it.
There is so much opportunity, obviously, in Penrith at the moment, and a lot happening in terms of Western Sydney Airport only a couple of years away. You mentioned that the Olympic venue remains and is now in state government hands as well. So there's some investment there. We saw Penrith Lakes, a lot more tourism. We're seeing a big boost in new restaurants and new developments. So there's a lot coming together, but pretty critical that we get it right, I guess, and that because the alternate, getting it wrong, is probably not good for Penrith at all in terms of where it sits in the future.
That's right, and it's interesting. It depends who you talk to about this, but some people say, "Oh, Penrith's had it good," in the last 10 years in terms of new infrastructure. Northern Road upgrades out to the airport, or the pedestrian bridge across the river, the hospital, and others would say, "Well, no, it's just getting what it deserves," and that there's this sort of east versus west, and we hear a lot about that. So. The investment that comes west relatively per capita is less in its arts, in culture, in health, in livability, in infrastructure, and so on. So I think it's important to realise that there's a lot more that can be done there, but money's running out. Like, government doesn't have bottomless pockets, and doing more with what we've got is critical now. You mentioned about getting it right, and I think the planning and the placemaking, as people like to call it, is important now. So, what does High Street look like going forward? You've got multiple landowners, property owners down there. How can they collaborate to really make that a thriving precinct? The Panthers, the stadium, that's a huge infrastructure project coming forward. How do those precincts link up? Panthers is a huge property owner. And they're playing a much stronger role in community, which is great. And then you go, airport, St Mary's. How do we sort of, St Mary's has always been there. There's so much history in St Mary's, but it's going to be transformed. So how do we get that right? And then the linkages. So I think it's not something that any agency or any arm of government can do alone. And I think it's something that business owners, landowners, developers need to be part of and be involved in, because it's only through that collaboration that we can get it right. And it's not going to be easy, but what we've got is natural beauty with the river and the mountains and the lakes to unlock eventually. So I think Penrith's got a great future.
Exciting times ahead for sure. Talking of exciting times, it is an Olympic year, as we mentioned. What can we expect from the Fox family in 2024?
Well, I think you'll see us at the airport. Actually, Jess and Naomi and Miriam will be off quite soon, a couple of weeks at most. Training camp in Paris for Jess, so that's with the rest of the Olympic group. Naomi, she still has to qualify. She's still got a chance to get to Paris, and she has to earn that spot in Prague in June, and that story is sort of out there, and it's great to sort of see her owning that journey. So she'll be going over shortly for some training, and then again for World Cups in early June, and then on to Paris from there. I'll be going over to support, so probably a couple of trips for me involved, and I'll be, unlike in Tokyo, I won't be back here and in a studio. I'll be hopefully riverbank in Paris and cheering them on.
Now, last question we always ask, just to stump you. How would Richard Fox like to be remembered?
Well, I don't know. I'd like to be remembered as a happy paddler on the Nepean, going up into the gorge and admiring the beauty of nature. But yeah, on water.
All right. Well, it's a great story, and it's had a couple of different chapters, and a great family story as well. Richard, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Troy.
and I hope you enjoyed our chat. On the Record is produced by the Western Weekender and recorded at Studio 103 in Penrith. To hear future episodes, search Western Weekender wherever you listen to podcasts and make sure you hit subscribe. Check out westernweekender.com.au and we will see you next time.